Hello, my name is Ashley Crossway. I'm a doctorate and athletic training student at Indiana State University, and this is my presentation on injury prevention models. To begin, we're going to start with the history of injury prevention models. In 1992, Van Mechelen created his four-stage sports injury prevention model. He used a standard public health prevention model and modified it to fit the sports injury context. This was the most widely cited model for the following decade. As you can see in the schematic, the four-step process to the Van Mechelen model. Step 1 is determining what the problem is and how bad the problem is. Step 2 is establishing the cause of injury or the circumstance of injury, essentially the why. Step 3 is to introduce or propose possible solutions. And then step 4 is to determine the success by starting over with step 1 and reassessing the problem. This model was great, however it had several downfalls. The Van Mechelen model does not address implementation issues. Laboratory success does not necessarily mean clinical success. Researchers often control for variables, however you cannot control for all those variables during wholesale implementation. A prevention program could be the best out there, however if the athletes, coaches, or administrators do not comply, then it does not matter. This brings us to the present day, and a possible solution is a TRIPP model. TRIPP stands for Translating Research into Injury Prevention Practice. As you can see in this diagram, the TRIPP model is framed by the black box and is compared to the Van Mechelen model to the right. Step 1 of the TRIPP framework is injury surveillance, with a standardized definition and reliable methods to determine the problem and the extent of the problem. Step 2 is to understand the etiology and mechanism of injury. We need to understand why these injuries are occurring. Step 4 is to identify possible solutions to this specific problem through a multidisciplinary approach including biomechanics, psychology, and sports medicine. As you can see, steps 1 through 4 of the TRIPP framework are very similar. However, steps 5 and 6 is where the TRIPP framework addresses the insufficiencies of the Van Mechelen model. Step 5 is to determine the motivators and barriers of implementation. This is directed by the culture of the sport. And then step 6 is the actual implementation of the intervention in a real-life setting and then reevaluating its effectiveness. The TRIPP model is important because it combines evidence of laboratory research with clinical implementation. It addresses the concerns of all parties involved and is important because only research that is adopted by the targeted audience will prevent injuries. Reflection. The TRIPP concept simply made sense to me, and it made the light bulb go off in my head. The TRIPP framework is all-encompassing. However, I have not used the TRIPP framework or much injury prevention at all at my clinical site. As a solo secondary school clinician, I tend to spend most of my time on acute care and rehabilitation simply due to time, personnel, and equipment restraints. I think the TRIPP model is a great model because it's all-encompassing, multifactorial in nature, and addresses the problem from start to finish in a multidisciplinary approach. However, the TRIPP process can be very arduous and relies heavily on injury surveillance, which in and of itself is a weakness. But in the end, I think TRIPP can improve clinical practice because it makes the connection between the evidence found in the laboratory setting and the real-life implementation into clinical practice. Additionally, the multifactorial process and multidisciplinary approach attempts to comprehensively solve the problem of interest. Again, this was my presentation on injury prevention models. Thank you for watching, and here is my reference.